I think it's fair to say that we all know that there are times in life when obstacles just seem too big, where situations arise and you just can't seem to find a way out or a way to overcome. And in times like those, it's so easy to just freak out, to curl up in a ball and hide from whatever is going around us, because hiding in fear is seemingly easier than facing a problem straight on. We do it when there are too many unknowns or when we've maybe failed before. We hide when we just don't think that we can do it, or when we simply don't know where to start. It seems to be human nature to run away from a problem when the odds don't seem to be in our favor. And everyone loves an underdog story, but if you think about it, no one really wants to be the underdog. Unless that is, you know that you have an advantage that no one else is aware of, if things maybe aren't quite the way that they seem. Now, what we have here this morning seems like a true underdog story. Goliath, a giant, unbeatable, versus David, the little guy, utterly unremarkable. He's totally gonna lose. Goliath is huge, and David just seems stupid. It seems obvious. Except things aren't always what they seem. And we know that there's a twist. Now, you probably know who Goliath is, but just in case you need a refresher, here you go. Goliath was in all respects giant. At close to 7 feet tall and with the best and heaviest armor money could buy, covering him head to toe. He had a spear weighing in at 600 shekels of iron. He has a sword, he has a javelin. Goliath had everything he needed to win. I mean, he is huge by today's standards, so imagine how giant he would have been when the standard human was much smaller than we are today. And then add to that the incredible armor and weapons. And this guy is absolutely intimidating. He is unbeatable. And instead of bringing both armies into combat to avoid too much bloodshed, Goliath is calling out to them to stand down from battle, and instead calling them to send one man to fight Goliath. Single combat style, winner takes all. So this terrifies Saul and all of Israel. They don't know what they're going to do. They don't know who's going to stand up to this giant, especially because it seems like Goliath knows that he will win. And so Goliath has all of the confidence that a guy could have, and rightfully so. But things aren't always as they seem. Because here comes little old David. Out of nowhere, coming in to check on his brothers, he sees what's going on and he starts to ask questions. This young servant boy knows something that no one else does. And with that knowledge, he steps up to fight the giant when no one else would. Now, ranks of warriors surrounded them. They've been there for 40 days or so, and not one stepped forward to take on Goliath until David. So Saul, after some protest, gives in and puts his own armor on David and gives him his own weapons to give David a little protection, knowing full well that the chances of David making it back were slim to none. But David doesn't seem so concerned. In fact, he takes all of the armor back off. I can't move in this stuff, he says. And grabbing a few rocks from the dry riverbed nearby, he heads off to meet Goliath with nothing but his sling and some rocks and his shepherd's bag and his shepherd's staff. Or so it seems. You see, David had something else with him. He had something invisible. David had the faith that God was with him. He knew that God had helped him defeat lions and bears when protecting his flock before. He had confidence in God, a confidence that is often hard for us to have. And David, because of that faith and confidence, wasn't going to huddle away in fear or watch his people be demolished on the battlefield. Instead, David put on the armor of God and let his faith lead him to victory, to change the situation, to stand up for God. So while this seems like your typical underdog story, There's so much more going on than meets the eye. Now, I wonder if you've ever heard of Andrei Rene Roussimoff. You may know him better as Andre the Giant. He was a famous French wrestler and actor later on in his life. He made his way to North America and to the US and was a WWF fighter. And he was huge, kind of like Goliath. And he lived the life. He was beloved. People came from all over to see him. He was the good guy. He made the big bucks. He partied it up. He seemed to have it all. But you probably know where I'm going with this, because things aren't always what they seem. You see, underneath all of the glitz and glamour and adoring fans, Andre the Giant lived a hard life. He suffered from gigantism, which caused something called acromegaly, and that condition can cause a lot of problems, like severe joint pain and arthritis, heart and organ failure, vision problems, and many more. Not to mention that the stress that being that size puts on one's body in general. So while Andre the Giant looked to be living the good life, he had serious health problems, pain, worsening vision. From the outward appearance, he was incredible and unbeatable. But if you looked a little bit deeper, just under the surface, you would start to see the cracks in that appearance. So why am I telling you this? Great question. Well, some scholars think that Goliath probably suffered from the same condition. His outward appearance could scare off even the most fierce opponent, but that wasn't the whole story. Goliath wasn't all that he seemed. He had to be led out onto the battlefield slowly. He calls David to come to him, perhaps because his vision was affected. And then David is clearly not planning to go hand-to-hand combat when coming down the mountainside. He has no armor or hand-to-hand weapons like Goliath, only a sling and some rocks. But Goliath doesn't seem to see that. Perhaps he can't see well at all. And then when you take into account David's weapon, this is not just some slingshot you can buy at the dollar store, something you might give to a child. No, David is an expert with this thing. He's basically an archer, a slinger, one of 3 types of warriors. These things were lethal. In fact, studies have found that a sling, when kind of whirled over one's head with the extreme density of the rocks found in that area, would have the stopping power of a .45 caliber handgun when slung with skill, and could maim targets from a great distance, even up to 200 feet. So while David may not be quite the underdog as we initially want to think, though he is very clearly underestimated, until he slings that rock right in the sweet spot between Goliath's eyes. David had faith in God. He knew God protected him when he fought the lions and the bears off of his flock in the past, and he trusted that this time would be no different. And because of that faith, he knew that there was something that only his trust in God allowed him to see, that there was a different way to go about beating Goliath. He only needed to think outside of the box, to use his God-given talents to beat Goliath a different way. He knew that there was no way he'd win with a conventional and assumed course of action, which would have been hand-to-hand combat. So while everyone else was trying to figure out how to fight Goliath the normal way, David, with God behind him, blew all of them out of the water. He knew he wouldn't win in hand-to-hand combat, but he knew he had a chance if he went about it a different way. And he did, and he triumphed. You see, he was confident, because in addition to some of Goliath's potential health issues, David had something behind him that Goliath didn't. He had God. I wonder how often we look at some impossible situation and just give up, or assume that there's nothing that we can do about it and leave it for someone else to tackle. Knowing that someone has to do something, but not wanting to be the one that steps up, or maybe not knowing how to step up. And therefore we hide because the obstacle is just too big. It's too scary, and those chances of failure are just too high. It's so easy to let excuses get in our way, and we're prone to look at a situation and think it impossible, so we might as well not try. But like in David's situation, there's always a way. And sometimes that solution takes someone being willing to try. To take one for the team, it takes one of us standing up and trying something new, something unconventional, going against the status quo in some unexpected way, to think outside of the box, to rely on God, having faith in that unbreakable bond and refusing to let our own fear get the best of us. We often seem to forget that we have something extra backing us up. The Holy Spirit moving among us, around us, throughout us, within us. And we fall into despair so easily, comes from living in fear of the unknown. And in turn, we miss all of the abundance that God provides for us. Now we know that the mission of God requires us to be willing to trust in God, knowing that God gives us each the means necessary to triumph over evil, to make a change in the world. If only we turn to God and look for different ways. We have to know ourselves, of course, like David did. We have to be willing to admit that sometimes the best way isn't the easiest or maybe the most well-known way. And we have to admit that we can't do it alone. It takes faith to walk a different path, to step out. Faith that God is working with you and through you, and faith that God won't let you fall flat on your face. In the same way that Jesus calmed the waters for the disciples, so he calms the waters in our lives. Are you still afraid? He asks us, even though you know who I am. Things aren't always what they seem. It doesn't always take a Herculean effort to better the world. Sometimes it takes a David, someone with a faith in their own abilities, someone willing to go about it a different way, someone willing to risk it all, knowing that they have the love of God behind them, no matter what, someone who will stand up for God. And we can be like David, having faith that Jesus will be there when we need him, to calm the waters, to push us forward, and to give us strength and comfort, knowing that when we have faith in God, anything is possible. And knowing that when you have faith in God, this question becomes a little bit easier. Should you or should we continue to hide in fear? Or is it time to step out with God behind us and to walk in faith? Amen.